Now we've just finished saying that APIs are extremely flexible and they're the way that we enable all programmatic interaction. So it can be tempting to think that we should make APIs for everything. Let's just make everything accessible by publicly available APIs. And in one sense that makes sense, because when we're designing APIs we want to maximize their utility. Because we want our APIs to be used. For some companies, their APIs are their sole product, right? If you're building an API platform. So this can be really important. But at the same time, there's some major drawbacks of having these APIs, and that's technical debt. So when we're designing our APIs, we want to maximize utility while trying to minimize our technical debt as much as possible. And this can be a difficult process in general. So as with the traditional design process, when we're designing APIs, we need to get a bunch of stakeholders together. We need to figure out what the use cases are for APIs, and we need to figure out what their costs are going forward, because we're going to need to support these for a long, long time in the future. And this really is an iterative process. So going through an iterative design process, just as for a whole system, is really important in this space. There are a variety of high-level API design principles that are used in practice, but we'll go through 4 of them right now. These were really popularized by Josh Block at Google. He was actually the chief architect for the collections framework within Java as well, so he has a lot of great experience in designing APIs that have been widely used in practice. So let's take a look at a concrete example. Assume you have a method called getPaidUser and sortByName. So one of the first API guidelines that are used in practice is that APIs should do one thing and do it well. And if you take a look at this method here, it's actually doing a lot of things. It's getting paid users and it's sorting. But what we can do is we can try to simplify this API to be easier to use and interact with. So let's change it here. All right, so what we've done here is we've simplified the API, right, from being getPaidUser and sortByName to getUsers. That takes a Boolean for whether or not the user is paid, and sortIndex, which is an index into the fields within the user object for sorting. Okay, so this really simplifies the name of the API itself. But the next high-level guideline is that API should never expose internal implementation details. And there really is a red flag here in this example, and this is sortIndex in terms of internal implementation details. Right? sortIndex is an index into the inside of the user object that's being tracked by this API. And we really shouldn't be exposing that to the users. So let's refactor this in a different way again to try to adhere to this design guideline. All right, so what we've done here instead is we've changed from sortIndex down to this key notion, right? So we're using a key instead of an index. And this users.key will end up being an enumeration that's a part of the public API as well. So as an API consumer, you can go and read the documentation and understand what those correct keys are, right? So that helps to make this part of the API actually visible to the clients. But one other design piece of advice that's often given, and this might be the most important, is that API should be as small as possible. And what this suggests for this API is maybe we don't need this notion of sorting at all. Maybe the API shouldn't be doing that for us, and the clients should instead take care of sorting in whatever way they need to, whatever way they see fit. So that could refactor this method to look more like this. Right, so this makes it much simpler, right? So now as the API producer, you don't need to worry about all of the different sortings that could have been provided through this users.key mechanism, right? And you leave that to the client, the API consumer, to figure out how to sort on their own. And one final high-level piece of design advice for designing APIs is to consider API usability. And this is kind of feels a little bit odd, right? Because when we talk about APIs, we say that they're for programs to communicate with one another. But an engineer, a software engineer, would have had to read the documentation for that API in the first place to figure out how it worked and make the code do what he wants. Right? And in this case, if we wanted to make this API just a little bit easier to use, right? We would just add information about the return type as well. And in this way, the developer can read this simple signature and have a really clear understanding of what the parameter is and the return type that they're going to get back. Right, so thinking about the usability of an API is a critical piece when we're trying to make our APIs so that people can use them as effectively as possible and with as few errors as possible.